The second hand kept making its small, private jumps. It did not glide. It did not hurry. It clicked, as if each click had to be earned, as if time were a door with a stubborn latch. The clock sat high enough that no one could reach it without standing, and no one stood unless they had to. The room had learned the shape of waiting and arranged itself around it. Someone's shoe scraped once along the floor, and then stopped, as if the sound had been an accident. A page turned, slow, careful. Paper dragged over paper with a faint sigh. Then the page was turned back again. The same paragraph reread, the same words tolerated, because rereading was something hands could do while the rest of a person stayed pinned in place. A man at the far end of the table folded a strip of cigarette, unfolded it, folded it again. He did not light anything. He kept the unlit cigarette between his fingers, tapping it gently against his knuckle, not to pack it, just to feel the tap. Tap, tap, tap. It was a rhythm that pretended to be a decision. Across from him, a pencil hovered above a blank margin. The point never touched down. The hand holding it made tiny adjustments. Thumb shifting, forefinger tightening, loosening, each movement too small to count as action, but too constant to call stillness. A drop of ink on the page nearby had dried into a dark, deliberate dot, a mark left by someone who had been interrupted mid-thought and never returned to it. There was a smell of damp wool and old heat. Somewhere, metal cooled. Somewhere else, the faint sting of something cleaned too recently, sharp against the heavier. The air held the memory of other bodies who had waited here before, their breaths lay, their impatience absorbed into the walls. Even the chairs seemed to know how to endure. In the corner, a kettle did not boil. It had already boiled earlier and been forgotten. The water inside it settled into quiet again, a heat without purpose. A cup sat half full beside it, a skin forming on the surface, thin and gray. No one reached for it. The cup was proof that time passed even when no one moved. A door at the back of the room stayed shut, not locked, just shut, as if the simple fact of being closed could hold the world at bay. The handle had a bright spot where hands had touched it too many times. Every few minutes, someone's eyes slid to that handle, not with hope, with measurement, as if the closed door were another clock. From outside, there came the dullest kinds of sounds, a distant engine idling and then stopping, a chain dragged over wood, a low murmur that might have been voices or wind pressed into a gap. None of it entered fully. It arrived muffled, filtered, respectful of the room's authority. The room was the center of something and yet contained nothing but small gestures and withheld words. A cough, short and controlled, as if permission had been requested first. Then silence again, thick enough to feel against the teeth. The kind of silence that makes you hear your own swallowing. The kind of silence that makes you aware of fabric shifting as someone inhales. Someone laughed once, only a single breath of laughter, and then cut it off immediately, embarrassed by the sound, as if humor were a breach. The man with the unlit cigarette smiled without showing teeth, a reflex more than a feeling. His fingers still tapped. Tap, tap, tap. There were documents on the table, stacked, aligned too neatly, as if order could be manufactured through straight edges. The top sheet had creases where it had been folded and unfolded so many times that the paper had begun to surrender. The corners curled upward slightly, impatient. A stamp mark sat near the bottom, faded ink pressed into fiber, official enough to be unquestionable, ordinary and be ignored. A pen cap clicked on, then off, then on again. The sound was sharp, a tiny percussion. It tried to be a signal, and failed. The cap was set down carefully, picked up again, set down again. The hand holding it was steady, but the need to do something made the steadiness look like restraint. Somewhere in the room, a watch vibrated against skin as its wearer flexed a wrist. The watch did not ring. It simply reminded the body that it existed. The wearer glanced down and the face showed. The wearer did not sigh. He simply looked up again, as if pretending he had never looked down in the first place. A strip of light cut across the floor, pale and dusty. It did not move quickly. It shifted like a tired animal changing position. In that strip of light, dust floated, turning slowly, each particle visible only because it had nothing else to do. They rose and fell in no hurry, obedient to currents no one felt. In the stillness, small things became enormous. A thread loose on a sleeve, a notch in the edge of the table, the gentle tremor in someone's knee that betrayed a thought they were not saying out loud, the faint mark left by a cup that had sweated earlier, a ring that would remain until someone wiped it away, which no one did. There was no clear authority no one spoke in the tone of everyone behaved as if command existed somewhere else, off stage, approaching, delayed. They waited not only for a person, but for a permission, for a certainty, for a line that would make the next action feel inevitable rather than chosen. The door stayed shut. The clock kept clicking. The unlit cigarette kept tapping. Tap, tap, tap. And with every click, The space inside the room shrank by a fraction no one could measure, until even the calm began to feel like something fragile you could break by breathing too hard. Time was not stopping. It was running out. A man came in without taking his coat off. The door opened in a controlled way, not slammed, not rushed, and yet every head lifted as if a string had. Cold air rode in on his shoulders and slipped across the floor, stirring the dust in that thin strip of light. For a moment the room smelled like outside, wet earth, exhaust, iron, and then the door closed again, and the room resumed being its own world. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. He carried a folder under one arm, the kind made from stiff gray board that could survive being handled too many times. The folder's edge was darkened from fingers, the corners softened. He set it down and the table gave a small, obedient sound, wood acknowledging weight. "Tea?" someone asked, too quickly, as if offering tea could make the next minutes ordinary. The man glanced at the cup with the skin on it and shook his head once. Not refusal, not disinterest, just emotion that meant there would be no small comforts now. He pulled out a chair and sat, posture careful, as though his spine had been trained to avoid certain angles. His boots left a faint smear of mud near the chair leg. No one mentioned it. Outside, something rumbled, heavy vehicles passing at a distance, the sound rolling through the building like far-off surf. The rumble faded, returned, faded again, as if the world were pacing. The room began to fill with quiet details that had nothing to do with the folder, and everything to do with the fact that there was a war on. A cracked map case leaned against the wall, its strap repaired with twine. A helmet sat upside down on a shelf, used as a bowl for loose nails and folded notes. A radio unit in the corner had its cover off, wires exposed like ribs, and a young technician sat near it with a screwdriver balanced between his fingers, listening more than working. The man with the unlit cigarette finally lit it. The match flared, brief and bright, and for a second it put warm color in everyone's faces. Then the flame died and smoke took its place, thin at first and then steady, rising as if it had somewhere to be. The cigarette's first exhale drifted toward the ceiling, turning the room older. A pencil finally touched paper, not words. A line, then another. Someone started writing the date in the margin and stopped halfway through, as if the numbers themselves might be wrong. The new arrival opened the folder. The sound of the clasp was small, but it landed like metal. He laid out a sheet, then another, aligning them with the edge of the table the way a surgeon might align instruments. He did not look up as he did it. He acted as if seeing faces would slow him down. "Any word?" a voice asked from the far end. The question was made soft on purpose, the way you speak in a chapel. The man took a moment before answering, not because he didn't know, but because he had to choose which part of the truth could be said aloud. "Not yet." That should have been comforting. "Not yet" meant time still existed, meant there was still a space between now and whatever everyone was pretending not to name. But in the room, it settled like grit. "Not yet" was also what you said when you could hear the rails vibrating before the train appeared. Someone tried to make a joke about the hour. It came out thin, dry, and was left alone. A smile crossed a face and disappeared. The technician by the radio tightened a screw that didn't need tightening. Beyond the walls, life continued in its disciplined way. Boots on gravel. A shouted number, repeated back. A clang of something dropped and retrieved. A whistle that cut the air and then was swallowed again. The sounds were not frantic. They were routine. That was the unsettling part. Routine had survived long enough to become its own kind of denial. The man with the folder finally looked up. His eyes moved across the table, not scanning for enemies, but for steadiness. He found little of it. There was an older officer with a calm face and tired hands. There was a runner in the corner trying to look invisible. There was a clerk whose fingers were stained with carbon paper, as if he had been touching ghosts. None of them spoke. The older officer cleared his throat once. "We're still on schedule," he said, not as a statement of fact, but as an offering, something to hold. The man with the folder nodded, but the nod was not agreement. It was acknowledgement of the sentence's existence. He tapped a page with his finger and kept his finger there, pinning it, as if the paper might try to escape. "You've seen this?" he asked. The older officer leaned forward. He did not touch the paper. He read from a distance, eyes narrowing. The room leaned with, drawn by gravity. The paper was ordinary. Lines, columns, numbers, a time written in careful ink, names reduced to initials. The kind of document that made enormous things feel manageable. The kind of document that hid the fact that every line represented a human body somewhere, doing something in the cold. The clerk beside the older officer began to repeat the numbers under his breath. Not loud enough to be a briefing, only loud enough to keep himself from thinking. The repetition filled the silence like a small engine. In the corner, the radio unit crackled softly, just static shifting, like someone turning over in their sleep. The technician's head tilted, his hand froze above the wires. Everyone pretended not to notice, because noticing would mean admitting they were waiting on voices they could not control. A runner came in quietly, delivered a folded note, left quietly. The note was read, refolded, slid back into a pocket. No announcement. Nothing changed, which was its own kind of Somebody poured fresh tea anyway. The kettle protested with a faint hiss. The steam rose in thin ribbons and vanished. The cup was passed to no one in particular, a gesture made to keep hands occupied. Minutes stretched. The clock kept clicking, stubborn and unromantic. The outside rumble returned, closer now, and the glass in the window trembled once, just slightly, as if the building itself could feel the approach of something heavy. The older officer said, "We've done it this way before." No one challenged. No one agreed either. The sentence floated in the room, a fragile bridge laid over a dark gap. The man with the folder closed it again, slowly, as if shutting the folder could shut the future. He kept his palm resting on top of it. "Hold," he said. It was a simple word, and it did not sound like relief. It sounded like pressure. And as the room settled back into its measured breathing and its careful silence, the sense of waiting shifted, subtly, almost politely, into something else. Not calm, a tightening, as if the stretched time had begun, very gently, to pull back. The radio clicked again. Not a message, not even a voice. Just a brief, dry interruption in the static, a throat being cleared somewhere far away. The technician adjusted a dial by a fraction, then another. The static returned to its previous texture, as if nothing had happened. He did not look up. He did not say anything. If he named the sound, it might demand an answer. A chair leg scraped as someone shifted weight. The scrape was immediately regretted. The leg was lifted and set down again, softer this time. The room absorbed the correction and went on. Outside, the light had changed. It was not darker. It was thinner. The color had drained slightly, leaving everything flatter, more exposed. The strip of light on the floor no longer reached as far as it had earlier. No one remarked on it. No one tracked it with their eyes. The change was too gradual to argue with. The man with the unlit cigarette stubbed it out in an ashtray already crowded with twisted remains. He pressed down longer than necessary, grinding until the ember surrendered completely. Smoke curled up anyway, the last of it refusing to be efficient. He stared at the ashtray for a moment, as if trying to remember when he had lit the cigarette in the first place. The clerk reached for a fresh sheet of paper and hesitated. He turned the old one over, scanned the blank back, then turned it face up again. The numbers already written there looked slightly wrong now, though they had not changed. He added a small mark beside one line, nothing official, just a dot, so he would remember to return to it later. He would not remember why. A sound came from beyond the walls, sharper than before, metal on metal, not an accident, a coupling, a gate, something being aligned. The sound repeated, more distant this time, as if the source had moved or the listener had. The room did not react. Sound, here, was not evidence. It was background. Someone near the window frowned, just for a second. The glass vibrated again, faintly, then settled. He relaxed his face, smoothed it back into neutrality. He did not want to be the first to look alarmed. The older officer leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly through his nose. "They're late," he said, not loudly, and not to anyone in particular. The man with the folder did not answer. He shifted his hand on the folder's cover, sliding it half an inch to the left, then stopping. The movement was careful, as if the folder were connected to something else by a wire no one could see. "Late happens," someone else said. It was meant to close the matter. It did not. The technician adjusted the dial again. The static thinned for a heartbeat, just enough to suggest structure beneath it, an almost pattern, a suggestion of cadence, and then thickened again, closing like water over a stone. The technician's jaw tightened. He wrote something on a scrap of paper, then crossed it out, leaving a dark smear. At the edge of the table, a hand traced the grain of the wood. The fingertip followed the same line again and again, a shallow groove worn smooth by years of similar gestures. The repetition was unconscious. It was a way of anchoring the body while the mind drifted toward things it had been trained not to consider. A runner passed the doorway without stopping. His boots were muddy, his stride uneven. He glanced inside as he went, just a flicker of attention, then disappeared down the corridor. No message delivered, no interruption justified. The absence of interruption felt heavier than any announcement. The older officer picked up a pencil and rolled it between his palms. "If there was a problem," he said, carefully. The sentence was built from habit. It rested on a long history of believing in lines of communication, in the reliability of systems that had once worked well enough. No one challenged. No one reminded him of the times they had known only after it was too late. Those memories stayed private. Another sound, closer now. Engines, more than one, not accelerating, idling, waiting. The sound pressed against the walls and did not go away. The building seemed to listen. The clerk glanced at the clock. He did not mean to. He caught himself and looked away, embarrassed, as if the clock had caught him back. The second hand kept its stubborn rhythm, clicking off the same small distance again and again. The minute hand had barely moved, but that, too, was an illusion. It was moving. Everything was. A loose sheet of paper lifted slightly at one corner as air moved through the room. Someone opening a door elsewhere. A draft finding its way along corridor. The paper settled back down. The older officer placed his palm flat on it, as if to reassure it. "Do we adjust?" someone asked. The question was phrased vaguely on purpose, without naming what would be adjusted or why. The man with the folder did not answer immediately. He looked at the radio, then at the window, then at the faces around the table. Each glance was brief, almost polite. "Not yet," he said again. The phrase sounded different this time, less like patience, more like delay. The technician swallowed and leaned closer to the radio. He lowered the volume slightly, then raised it again. In the static, there was a faint pulse now, irregular but persistent. He waited for it to become something he could justify pointing out. It never quite did. Outside, someone shouted an instruction. It was repeated, louder, then acknowledged. The words themselves were indistinct, carried off by distance and machinery, but the cadence was familiar. The tone was not alarmed. It was procedural. That was the comfort. That was the danger. The man who had been tracing the table's grains stopped. His finger hovered for a moment, uncertain where to rest, then curled into his palm. He folded his hands together, interlacing his fingers tightly enough to leave marks. A faint smell drifted in, fuel or hot oil. It mixed with the room's older smells and became something new, something sharper. No one commented on it. Smells were not actionable. The older officer stood, slowly, as if standing were a negotiation with gravity. He walked to the window and looked out, his back to the room. His shoulders were squared, his stance confident, the posture of someone who had been seen doing this before. He did not stay long. He returned to his chair and sat without expression. "Everything looks normal," he said. The man with the folder nodded once. The clerk made another small mark on the page, then another, as if adding them could turn intuition into data. The radio clicked again. This time, a fragment broke through. Half a word, maybe a number, distorted beyond certainty. The technician froze, then the sound vanished, swallowed by static. He opened his mouth, closed it, then reached for the dial again. "Interference," he said quietly, to no one in particular. No one contradicted him. The engines outside kept idling. The light continued to thin. The clock continued to click. And beneath the surface of routine, beneath the tea poured and not drunk, the documents aligned and realigned, the assurances offered and accepted, something shifted, almost imperceptibly. Warnings did not arrive as sirens or shouts. They arrived as small deviations that everyone agreed not to name. The door opened again, and this time, no cold air followed it. The runner stood there, hand still on the frame, breathing through his nose as if he had just decided not to run. Mud clung to the hem of his trousers, drying in uneven patches. He looked younger than the others, or maybe just less practiced at hiding what his body knew before his mind had caught up. He did not speak immediately. That hesitation changed the temperature of the room more than any word could have. "Yes?" the older officer said gently, as if encouraging a nervous witness. The runner stepped inside and closed the door behind him with care. Too much care. He held out a folded slip of paper. It was smaller than the others that had passed through the room that day, creased sharply, folded more times than necessary. The man with the folder took it without comment. Everyone watched him. The reading took only seconds. The paper was folded again, slid into the folder, and disappeared. The man's face did not change, but something in his posture did. A subtle shift, as if his weight had moved forward on his feet, even while he remained seated. "Thank you," he said to the runner. The runner nodded once, as if relieved to have done his part, and backed toward the door. He hesitated again, just for a fraction of a second, then left. The door closed. The latch clicked softly. The sound echoed longer than it should have. "What is it?" someone asked. "Confirmation," the man with the folder said. "Of what?" He did not answer that. Instead, he stood and walked to the window. He did not touch the glass. He did not lean forward. He simply looked, hands clasped behind his back, a posture learned long ago. Outside, the engines were still idling, their low vibration now a constant presence, no longer something that came and went. The technician turned his radio down another notch. The static softened but did not disappear. Beneath it, the irregular pulse persisted, more confident now, like a heartbeat that had decided to make itself known. He waited for instruction. None came. "We still have time," the older officer said, standing as well. He joined the man at the window, not look at each other. "If there's an adjustment to be made, this is when it happens." The sentence hung between them, careful and measured. It named the possibility without touching it. The man with the folder exhaled slowly. "Time," he repeated, as if testing the word's weight. At the table, the clerk flipped through his pages, stopping at a particular line. He ran his finger down the column, counting silently. When he reached the end, he frowned and went back to the beginning, as if hoping the numbers might rearrange themselves if given another chance. Outside, a whistle blew, short, precise. It was answered almost immediately. Somewhere metal shifted position. A chain tightened. The sounds were efficient, practiced. They suggested readiness, not danger. The man at the table who had been tracing the wood earlier stood abruptly, the chair legs scraping where he could stop them. He winced, muttered an apology that no one acknowledged, and moved closer to them. "There's more activity than usual," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "It's within parameters," the older officer replied. He had not turned away from the glass. The technician leaned closer to the radio again. This time, the static broke more clearly. A voice surfaced. Not complete, not clean, but unmistakably human. A word emerged, clipped and distorted, then vanished. The technician looked up. "Sir." The man with the folder raised a hand, not sharply, just enough. The technician stopped mid-sentence. The radio continued its quiet insistence. A presence rather than a message. A clock somewhere else in the building chimed the hour. It was faint, delayed by walls and distance, but it arrived all the same. The sound marked a boundary that no one had been counting down to, yet everyone felt pass through them. The older officer checked his watch. This time, he did not hide it. "We're approaching the margin," he said. The word margin did a lot of work. It suggested space, flexibility, room to maneuver. It also suggested the edge of a page, the place where writing ended whether you were finished or not. The man with the folder returned to the table. He opened the folder again, slower than before, and removed the same papers. He laid them out, but this time he did not align them perfectly. One sheet sat slightly askew, its corner overlapping another. No one commented, but the misalignment was noticed. "We could pause," someone said quietly. It was the clerk. His voice cracked on the last word. The older officer looked at him, surprised but not angry. "Pause what?" The clerk gestured helplessly at the papers, the window, the radio, the air itself. "Just pause." The man with the folder considered this. He did not dismiss it immediately. He rested his fingertips on the edge of the table and leaned forward, studying the clerk's face as if seeing it for the first time. Outside, one of the engines revved briefly, then settled again. The vibration through the floor deepened, a reminder that other people were already moving according to plans made earlier. "A pause," the man said slowly. "Requires a..." The clerk nodded. "Yes." The man looked around the room. The technician avoided his gaze. The man by the window stared straight ahead. The older officer's expression was calm, resolute, practiced. "We don't have disagreement," the older officer said. "We have incomplete information." The radio crackled, louder now. The voice returned, still fragmented, but the urgency in its cadence was unmistakable. A number came through clearly this time. Then static swallowed it again. The technician could not stay silent any longer. "That wasn't interference," he said. "That was..." The man with the folder closed the folder with a firm, final motion. The sound cut through the room, not loud, but decisive. "We hold," he said. The technician's mouth closed. He nodded once, swallowing whatever else he had been about to say. Outside, the whistle blew again, longer this time. It was answered by movement, coordinated, purposeful. Shadows shifted past the window, too many to count. The older officer straightened his jacket. The clerk gathered his papers into a stack that was no longer neat. Someone poured out the untouched tea into a nearby sink, the liquid disappearing with a soft rush. The room felt smaller now, not because anyone had moved closer together, but because the space for alternatives had narrowed. Every sound seemed nearer. Every breath seemed louder. The man with the folder checked his watch once more. "We're inside the window," he said. No one asked what happened when the window closed. They all felt it. And as the engines outside began to change their pitch, subtly, almost politely, the room crossed into a time where waiting was no longer passive. It was a countdown no one had agreed to start. The first thing that changed was not a sound, but an absence. The engines outside, which had been idling with patient regularity, shifted into a smoother, steadier tone. The unevenness disappeared. The vibration through the floor became uniform, no longer something that rose and fell, but something that simply existed, constant and assured. The building stopped trembling in surprise and began trembling in acceptance. No one spoke. The man with the folder remained standing, his watch face catching a sliver of light. The second hand moved. He did not look at it again. He already knew what it would say. The radio no longer crackled. The static thinned to a narrow hiss, like breath drawn through clenched teeth. The technician turned the dial slowly, carefully, searching for the place where the voice had been. He found only silence, shaped like signal. He froze his hand there, afraid that any further movement might be interpreted as resistance. Outside the window, a line of figures moved with new purpose. They did not hurry. They did not hesitate. Their spacing was precise, practiced. One of them stopped to adjust a strap on his shoulder, then rejoined the flow without disrupting it. The correction was seamless. No one looked back. The older officer cleared his throat and then seemed to think better of it. He folded his hands behind his back and stared at the wall instead of the window, as if the surface in front of him might be easier to face than the depth beyond the glass. His posture was impeccable. That was the problem. It meant there would be no visible struggle. At the table, the clerk noticed that one of the papers was no longer aligned with the others. He reached out to straighten it, then stopped halfway, his fingers hovering just above the page. He withdrew his hand and folded it into his lap instead. The paper remained crooked. A pen rolled slightly, nudged by vibration, and came to rest against the folder's end. The sound was soft, but it landed with an odd finality. No one reached to move it back. The man who had suggested a pause earlier swallowed and pressed his lips together. He stared at the floor, at the scuffed boots around him, at the faint mark where mud had dried and cracked. He seemed to be counting something. Breaths, maybe, or heartbeats. But whatever he was counting did not slow. From somewhere deeper in the building came a mechanical click, followed by another. Switches engaging. Systems acknowledging instructions that had already been given. The sounds were small and bureaucratic, the kind that rarely appeared in reports. The man with the folder spoke again, quietly. "It's in motion." He did not raise his voice. He did not look for confirmation. The sentence did not ask to be challenged. The older officer nodded once. Not approval, recognition. He adjusted his sleeve, smoothing a crease that did not matter. "Then we proceed," he said, as if describing a routine transition rather than the closing of it. The technician finally stepped back from the radio. He removed his headphones and set them down carefully, aligning them beside the unit. His hands lingered there, reluctant to. Without the headphones, the room felt louder, though nothing had changed. Outside, the whistle did not sound again. It did not need to. Movement continued without it, a chain reaction already complete. The figures beyond the window became harder to distinguish as they moved farther away, merging into shape and shadow. A distant sound reached them then. Not explosive, not dramatic, just a long, low note carried by air, like the groan of stressed metal or wind funneled through a narrow place. It was ambiguous enough to be ignored, and that was exactly what happened. The clerk wrote something at last. Not a number, not a note, just a short line in the margin, a mark that meant nothing to anyone else. When he finished, he closed the notebook and slid it into a drawer. The drawer shut with a soft click. The man with the folder returned to his seat. He did not reopen the folder. He rested both hands on it, palms flat, as if grounding himself. His shoulders relaxed by a degree so small it might have been imagined. Around the room, small preparations ceased. No more adjustments. No more checking. The gestures of potential intervention had ended without announcement. The waiting had changed shape again. Someone near the door took a step forward, then stopped, as if realizing too late that there was nowhere useful to go. He remained standing, stranded between positions. The engines outside continued their steady rhythm, now unmistakably moving away from readiness and toward execution. The vibration through the floor softened, stretched out, began to fade, not because the machines were stopping, but because they were leaving. No one spoke to stop them. The man with the folder closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his expression was composed, almost serene. The decision had not been made in this room, but the last opportunity to resist it had passed through here unnoticed. There was no signal, no declaration, just the quiet, irreversible sense that whatever line could have been held had already been crossed. And the room, finally understanding this, fell into a deeper kind of silence, one that no longer waited for permission. Silence settled the way dust does when a door closes and no one opens the room. No one left. They remained where they were, held in place by a shared awareness that movement would suggest intention, and intention no longer belonged to them. Even breathing seemed too deliberate. Each inhale was taken carefully, quietly, as if the air itself might object. Outside, the last of the engine noise thinned and stretched until it was no longer a sound, but a memory. The floor stopped vibrating. The walls released their tension. The building stood still, suddenly heavier without motion passing through it. The radio gave one final, almost apologetic hiss, and then went completely quiet. Not dead, just listening to nothing. The technician did not reach for it again. His hands rested on his thighs, palms down, fingers spread, as if he were anchoring himself to the chair. Light continued to drain from the window, not quickly, not dramatically. It faded the way ink fades on paper left too long in the sun. Shapes outside lost their edges. Distance became flatter, less readable. The world simplified itself. The older officer sat with his back straight, eyes forward. He had stopped checking his watch. Timekeeping was no longer his role. Whatever schedule had existed had detached from clocks and moved into momentum. The clerk remained seated, staring at the closed drawer where he had placed his notebook. He did not try to open it again. The mark he had written would never be clarified. It would sit there, permanent and meaningless, like a scar whose origin no one remembered. A faint creak came from somewhere above them, wood adjusting, or metal cooling. The sound traveled briefly, and then disappeared. No one looked up. The building was allowed its own reactions. Someone swallowed. The sound was loud in the quiet. He grimaced faintly, embarrassed by his own body's insistence on being alive. The man with the folder remained motionless, hands still resting on the cover. The folder felt heavier now, though it held no new information. It was no longer a container of possibilities. It was a record. From far away, so far it could almost be mistaken for imagination, came a low, continuous tone. It did not grow louder. It did not fade. It simply existed, pressing against the edges of hearing. Wind, perhaps. Or something else, moving through a space that could no longer be influenced from here. No one asked. No one named it. A single piece of dust drifted through the remaining light and landed on the corner of the misaligned paper. It stayed there, undisturbed. The paper was never straightened. The room held its breath without realizing it had done so. Then, somewhere beyond sight, beyond sound, beyond the reach of any hand in that room, time completed a movement it had begun long before any of them noticed. And just before the moment when waiting would no longer be possible, everything stopped.